Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. My name's Aly Madhavji. I run Blockchain Founders Fund, which is a venture capital firm focused on blockchain companies. I also am an advisor to the United Nations on emerging technologies, helping to improve things like financial inclusion and help to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals, working with central banks and finance ministers around the world. So what we're talking about is how blockchain will transform industries. This can impact every industry that you're in. And we're going to go through a number of different industries, such as supply chain, enterprise storage, identity management, even things like social impact and education and academics, to look at how is blockchain specifically impacting these industries and what are very specific use cases that companies are using right now and how that might be able to affect what you guys are doing in your companies. So first, what we're going to go through, in case you're not familiar, is the 5 innovations of blockchain and cryptocurrency. And then we're going to go through on how blockchain is already having a substantial impact across different industries. We're going to focus a little bit on supply chain, and we'll explain why, and how supply chain we can use as a case study, a more detailed case study, to see where supply chain is having innovations related to blockchain, and we can extract those innovations and efficiencies from the supply chain industry to your industries. And then we're going to look at overall how there's been substantial savings in industries like banking and finance and many other industries specific to how it can impact RPA. So, should I care about blockchain? It's a term you might have heard. A lot of people are using it as a buzzword. And yes, you should care about it, because we're looking at blockchain on how it can lower costs, how there can be less manual input. So if you're in something that's very manual, we can supplement it with other technologies, like things like IoT, so Internet of Things, and how that can help to decrease the amount of manual input. It can reduce things like manual reconciliation and errors related to that. And so that is another very big benefit that we can have from blockchain, and more reliable information from systems. It's essentially a 2.0 database, but we're going to go through the different aspects of blockchain and cryptocurrency shortly. We want to help you to understand the value of blockchain in your company, how it can help improve things like revenue, your sales, and help decrease things related to your costs, and how these innovations can change your industry. So, the 5 innovations of blockchain. The first 2 we're going to talk about are essentially created and became mainstream with Bitcoin. The last 3 that we're going to talk about became more mainstream with Ethereum, which is the 2nd largest cryptocurrency and blockchain platform. So the first one is an immutable ledger, or a source of truth. What this essentially is the ability to have one set of information where a number of parties have validated it, but you cannot actually change this information in the future. So it's a permanent record. And this can be very valuable across different industries, especially from things like fraud, manipulation of data, and other issues related to that, as well as ensuring that all parties are using the same information when they're part of an ecosystem, rather than having different versions of information, which can cause many issues in companies. The second one is the ability to move funds without a centralized entity or a middle entity. And this has become very valuable with blockchain and with Bitcoin, to be able to move money around the world very quickly and easily. The third one is smart contracts. These are essentially programmable contracts that auto-execute based on the contract design and the parameters that you set out. So imagine, as a quick example, you typically have contracts where you might have a lawyer involved, and there's probably a number of terms that say things like, once delivery of a good happens, we should release payment. But now the other party might be worried that, and they have counterparty risk, that that payment may not happen. You could actually program a smart contract to have money that auto-executes based on certain factors that come in, such as the delivery of goods, and that payment can automatically go out once something has happened, some certain actions. And this is quite flexible. It's still early stages, but this is developing in a way that can actually allow you to program essentially many different outcomes and how that would execute based on those contracts. The fourth innovation was the ability to crowdfund very effectively. So a term called ICOs, or initial coin offerings, which you may have heard of. This is a very big innovation on being able to look at global finance and capital coming into, a company or a solution from all around the world in a much more effective way. The first part, and ICOs had a lot of different troubles, but looking at the innovation around ICOs is very interesting when we consider things like the future of this and potentially better securities and protections for investors or companies around this, but the ability to look and access global capital. And the fifth one was the instant creation of accounts or bank accounts. And this is through digital wallets. And we're going to also use and show you an example of even how the United Nations has been using this with refugees. So 1,053 senior executives were surveyed from all around the world. This was a survey done by Deloitte, which is one of the top accounting firms and service firms globally. And what came up in terms of the best use cases for blockchain, the number one area that came up was actually supply chain. The number two one was Internet of Things. Number three was digital identities. We're going to go through each of these different industries to give you some case studies on how blockchain has been impacting these. We're also going to talk about areas such as payments, which came up at 30%. And also you can see things like voting, which shows up at 12%. The reason why something like voting shows up at 12% when in reality it's a very good use case for blockchain is because companies and organizations do not use democratic voting processes within their organizations, and that's why voting does not show up very high. So supply chain. It was rated the number one use case among senior executives for blockchain. So we're going to go through first food supply chain in a very specific way. That's something that impacts all of us here today on what we consume, how we consume it, and ensuring that we're getting the information around that food to make better choices. We're also going to talk about how blockchain is impacting and improving logistics. So that's what we typically think about when we think about supply chain and how is it impacting that space. So the leading technologies, according to 240 executives on a logistics management survey, was analytics as being the best technologies for managing supply chains, then the Internet of Things, and blockchain came in at number 3 at 9.3%. This is still growing as blockchain is still becoming more and more of a solution within the supply chain space as executives learn more. But as you can see, it is growing quite quickly in terms of interest from senior executives. So this is actually a publication in the largest blockchain magazine globally. There's a couple of 100,000 readers every month. And this is a column that we wrote. This just got published a few days ago on February 15th of this year. And we talk about how blockchain is revolutionizing food supply chains. And so we're going to go through a couple of things on here. You may have heard about some of the issues with food supply chains, and we're using this as a way for you to understand some of the ways where blockchain can really impact an industry and extract that to your industry. And so we go through examples of 3 different regions. We go through an example for Asia, for North America, as well as Europe. You may have heard of some of these. So the tainted milk scandal in China. So this was in 2008. You may have heard about dairy products being laced with melamine And this essentially impacted 300,000 babies, which got very sick from this. There was 6 fatalities from kidney damage. And so dairy products were laced with this chemical. The second example is Chipotle Mexican Grill. This is a fast casual fast food store in the United States, as well as a number of other countries. And in 2015, they had an E. coli outbreak. 55 customers were ill in 11 states. What resulted from this was a number of store closures temporarily, a lot of very bad press, and a 42% decrease in their stock price, which is in the billions of US dollars. And they never recovered fully from this. The horse meat scandal in Europe in 2013, you may have heard of this. So beef was, so horse meat, which was labeled as beef, was sold to consumers in major supermarkets like Tesco or other major supermarkets that people go to every day. And in many cases, in 13 countries where certain meat was advertised as beef, it was up to 100% horse meat from DNA sampling. You also had, in many samples, 85% of these, the meat being undeclared animal DNA, so they didn't know what it was. And you also had sports horses, which take certain types of drugs for performance in sports racing, which are not allowed to be consumed by humans. And that also showed up in the food supply chain, impacting, essentially a lot of people in Europe consuming this. This also had a very big problem because this happened in 2013. All the way until 2017, Interpol was still making arrests, and they were still trying to get to the bottom of this issue. So in 4 years, they were still trying to understand how this all happened and hold people accountable for this. That isn't just an issue, in one part of the world. This is something that happens everywhere. So what are the benefits of blockchain in this context? So with food supply chain, there's multiple suppliers, there's different ingredients. You've of course got a lot of different parties involved in the food supply chain. And so what blockchain can offer is increased transparency, more accountability, and more auditability. And so you saw when we talked about the 5 innovations of blockchain, having that single source of truth with a very strong record can be very valuable to companies, especially because there's all of these different suppliers involved with the process. It reduces error-prone manual reconciliation. So pairing blockchain with IoT, you can have things like temperature sensors so that you know what's in it. Every time that things are moved, for example, it moves from the slaughterhouse to packaging, you can actually have automatic-based sensors that are basically checking this off and uploading the data into a system. Of course, even when it is manual, you can actually put it into the system yourself, and you have real-time updates. So all of the different parties all have that same information. So it improves disclosure and accountability as well when interests aren't aligned. So if we take the example of the horse meat being labeled as beef, of course there was bad intentions. Blockchain isn't going to solve that. So it doesn't solve the garbage in problem. And so if you have bad actors and they purposely want to put bad data in, what happens? So with blockchain, all of that information would go into the blockchain. So all of that bad information, all of this horse meat that's labeled as beef would go in as beef. All of the other participants downstream would use that information. And so the negative part is it doesn't solve that problem. But the positive part is it's much easier to hold them accountable. So because you cannot change that information then, and you know that it's highly traceable, so once you do some DNA sampling, you can look at and say, this beef was not actually beef. it was horse meat, and you see exactly where that package of beef came from or horse meat came from, and you trace it to the exact suppliers who transported it and exactly which farm it came from. And so the cryptographic signatures make auditing the ledger and pinpointing the source of information easier, and therefore you can hold those individuals accountable. And by the sheer fact of being able to hold those individuals accountable increases the likelihood that they're not going to try to cheat the system and do unethical actions. But even if they do, it's more likely and quicker that they will get caught. So we're going to go through an example of Chinese pork going on the blockchain. So this is a joint venture between Tsinghua University, which is my alma mater. It is a Chinese university based in Beijing, Walmart, and IBM. And what they did is they were looking at tracking pork all the way from the farm, all the way through the process to all the way to the supermarket and packaging, et cetera. And so they did this for a few reasons. One, they wanted to prevent national foodborne outbreaks. And so this can lower costs. If there is an outbreak, you can help to pinpoint it quicker, and that will help you to lower costs. Walmart also opened a food safety innovation collaboration center in Beijing. And so this pilot included all throughout the process. So how pork flowed through commercial networks from the farm, the producers, the processors, the packagers, the distributors, and the grocers. And so going through that entire process on the blockchain. The things that they were tracking, there was a lot of different information, including all of those steps and who was part of that process, but also things like factory data, expiration dates, storage temperature, shipping information. And this pilot has gone very well that Walmart has actually been expanding this pilot. So they did another pilot and another trial. And this time they did it on mangoes. Okay? On mangoes, it took them 4 weeks originally without blockchain to trace and audit all of the people that touched those mangoes. 4 weeks. Now they can do it in 2.2 seconds. So this is a very big impact. This saves a ton of time of a lot of people involved in the process, including regulators, including anyone that's doing the auditing, including a lot of staff when there's an issue, and any sort of testing, et cetera. This makes it much more efficient because of these benefits of being able to trace directly to the source. We have another example. JD and Alibaba put a number of things on the blockchain. So you might be familiar that the fake and counterfeit good market is $500 billion US. This is a very big market. And JD has done a number of pilots using blockchain. Things like alcohol, different types of food, tea, pharmaceuticals. They also did beef on the blockchain. And this is the part that I want to focus on. Because not only does blockchain help you with better source of information and more ability to audit and track that information, but there's also benefits to the consumer, which can be a competitive advantage. So if you look over to here, this is actually information that gets shared with consumers of the beef. And this is a pilot. You can already go to certain stores and actually scan a QR code and see exactly where your beef came from. You can see what breed that cow was. You can see the weight of that cow. You also see things like the diet that it had. Was it grass-fed? Was it grain-fed? What types of things did the cow actually eat? Which people start to care about. Consumers are more and more interested in information to know what they're putting in their bodies. And in a lot of cases, more information across a lot of different industries, consumers want to know more. Also, even information like the veterinarian of the cow is actually being shared, which is interesting. Not that you can maybe do too much as a consumer with that information, but it is, reassuring that that type of information is being tracked and even shared at times. Ant Financial also looked at putting a number of things on the blockchain, things like liquor, pharmaceuticals, milk, and so these are things that are also being tracked. If we go to another example, in terms of the wine industry, so DIG is a major importer of wine. And a company like VeChain, which is a major blockchain company based in Shanghai in China, is actually has now put and is putting NFC chips that are linked to the blockchain onto 30% of the wine that's being imported into China. So this is a very big deal. And in China, there's a big problem with fake wine. So this helps to get to the bottom of it. With the China National Tobacco Corporation, VChain is working with them, and this is an industry where sales in China of cigarettes, you may not be aware of this, but China consumes 30% of the world's cigarettes. We're talking about over $100 billion a year. And what they're doing with the National Tobacco Corporation of China is looking at things like proof of origin. So they want to know where the tobacco came from. And this is strictly for purposes of taxes. So they want to be able to prove where the tobacco is going to and from. And so that they can essentially tax it, and the government can make more money off of this and collect their fair share of tax on it, as well as looking at anti-counterfeit on the tobacco, because there's a lot of things that can be laced into tobacco that essentially will allow them to sell it, but it's not actually pure tobacco. And so they want to be able to track that as well. And this is another way that they're using blockchain to do it. In terms of counterfeit luxury goods, I'm sure many of you have purchased or have seen people with luxury handbags. At times they can be fake, Louis Vuitton or Gucci or these other brands. And what Givenchy, which is a luxury handbag maker, has done is they've partnered with VChain, and already today, certain lines of their handbags have VChain chips in it. And what you can do is you can take out your smartphone, you can tap the bag, and using NFC technology paired with blockchain, you can see whether or not that bag is real. You can see where it was made and a number of other information related to that bag. And so this is already impacting consumers and helping to combat the counterfeit industry that exists. Discovery IoT. This is a company based out of India. They already move 150 million pounds of product per year. And what they're doing right now is they've created their own type of chip that has brought down the cost a lot, but they're piloting this with two major fast-moving consumer good companies, so FMCG companies in India. And what they've done is, typically the way warehouses work today is they use RFID, and they're based on line of sight, meaning you need to be in the line of sight of the products, and then you can use essentially this RFID to see kind of what's in that area. But it's only based on line of sight. And what Discovery IoT has done is they've paired blockchain with IoT and other types of sensors to essentially make this range-based. So it's a 30-meter range, but it uses mesh networks. So you can put multiple of these to increase the range. And now what you can do is make your warehouse much more efficient using things like 3D mapping of the warehouse and knowing where exactly your products are. They're also looking at a next version that's going to have even more sensors, things like temperature sensors and other types of sensors to be able to manage and help provide more information along that supply chain channel, so the logistics and transportation, as well as even trying to help consumers. So one of their visions is looking at pairing blockchain with IoT-based sensors that can predict even how much is remaining in an item. So imagine a bottle of shampoo and being able to predict when you're almost out of that shampoo for a consumer and automatically reordering that off of Amazon or Rakuten or one of these sites. And that would even help to improve the consumer lifestyle. And so this is something that can also help to increase sales in those ways. Identity management. So this was rated the number 3 use case among executives from the survey that we showed earlier. And this is very important because as the world has evolved significantly with the digitization and this era of everyone doing things on the internet, there's a very big disconnect of your identity in person and online. To prove someone and who they are online is very difficult. And for as low as $29, you can get around pretty much every existing online solution for verifying identity, just based on the fact that a lot of them are using technology where you take a photo of yourself as well as with your passport, and it's very easy to Photoshop that, and these systems won't pick that up. There's also no way that they can check where, like there's no area or government databases that they can check to verify this information, like your date of birth or other areas. These systems aren't plugged into that. And so what companies like Dero are doing, or Civic, is working on creating a digital identity that matches your physical identity, so you can be identified online. This is a lot of very big and important improvements for how we do things online. So the way Dero is doing it is they use trusted firsthand sources. So for example, you guys must all have bank accounts. And when you go into your bank account to set up your account, you personally go in, you take your ID, they can see who you are, and you now go through their KYC process and you get your bank account. What Dero is doing is they're leveraging all of these firsthand sites that you use, or these firsthand companies that you use. So like your bank accounts. If you have an online tax account where they've done an in-person KYC, and they've checked your identity in person, or other areas like your driver's license or other things where they've checked these in person, if you have a website for that. What Dero does is you can sign in to these firsthand websites with your username and ID, and they know if you can get into there, you've already been KYC'd in person from those websites. And so they basically screen capture all that data, as well as take all of the SSL documentation, so the encryption documentation based on those sites to make sure it's a legitimate site. And they basically use that to continue to build your profile. So when you sign into like 3 bank accounts that you own, now you've got a very strong profile because they know you signed into all 3 of these accounts, and for all 3 of those, you've already done in-person KYC. So that's a very interesting way to try to connect to your digital identity and your physical identities. Other companies are doing it in different ways. And Dero does, what they do is they then put that information on the blockchain to make sure it can't be manipulated and cannot be changed. Countries have actually even moved all the way to blockchain with identities. So Estonia, you may have heard of it, it's in Eastern Europe. They've moved over to all of their citizens to EIDs, is what they call it. They've credited a 2% savings on GDP for the entire country based on this move of digital identities. So this has a very big impact on the economy, as well as to individuals and how they can do things much more efficiently and much quicker, as consumers or even as companies representatives of companies. Enterprise communication. So a company like Loyak, what they're using blockchain for is creating a layer between companies to track, see, and manage your data across companies. And so imagine, and every year you might have heard of, let's say, situations like Apple and their new iPhone. And every year they have an iPhone design leak. And no one knows how that design gets out to the public before Apple announces it. And what you could do with a technology like Loyak is you can manage who can see the information when you're inside of the company, what they're allowed to do with it, like can they print it, can they screenshot it, when they email it to someone, you can track it, but even when you share it to partners outside of your company. So you're trying to create an infrastructure layer across different companies for this data. It has other implications. There is an executive of Nissan that's working with this company on the advisory board. And what Nissan has said, and the reason why it's interesting to them, is when a new car is being designed, there's 80 partners, 100 partners. It takes 4+ years to go from design to actualization, sometimes longer. And you have 80 different partners, let's say, and you want to share only select information with them. You also want to make sure that they're not sharing it with your competitors. You want to make sure that they always have the most up-to-date version. And so with technologies like Loyak, they can ensure that the information that should be seen by each of those partners is the information they're seeing, but also when they try to manipulate anything or print anything that they shouldn't be or share anything that they shouldn't be, they are able to set permissions on that information. Let's say then Nissan has new updated information that they want to circulate. they can very easily just replace that part of the information in this, and all parties are always using the most up-to-date version to prevent version control issues. So this even makes things like designing a car more efficient. Loyac is already working with 5 Fortune 500 companies, and their new version, which is on blockchain, allows them to do even more functionality based on discussions with those partners in the ways that I mentioned. Cryptic is an enterprise storage and cybersecurity solution. And I'm sure many people here have used Google Drive or OneDrive, which is a Microsoft product, or potentially Dropbox or Box. And what they are is they're a solution that's much more secure. So cybersecurity is a very big topic. $1 trillion US every year gets hacked. So this is a very big issue. And companies are spending up to $250 billion US a year on cybersecurity. And companies like Cryptic, what they're doing is they take a file, when you want to save a file onto their drive, they encrypt the file, they break it into 5 pieces, they encrypt it again, and then they store 1/5 on IBM, 1/5 on Google, 1/5 on Dropbox, 1/5 on Box, and 1/5 on another one like Amazon. And what this does is this makes it much more secure. It doesn't stop the hacking. 1/5 of that file can still get hacked. So if it gets hacked, only 1/5 of the file is hacked, and it's doubly encrypted. And so it's basically useless information that gets hacked when it gets hacked. You might not know this, but to have very good latency, so very quick speeds to access a file, when you store a file on Dropbox or Google, they're making hundreds of copies, generally over 200 copies of that file on different servers so that you can access it very quickly no matter where you are in the world, and so that when you're trying to collaborate with colleagues at work, you can access it very quickly. It doesn't matter where you are. But this just makes it more hackable. And so this is an issue that happens with these companies all the time having security breaches of data. Cryptic is just as fast. So under 200 milliseconds means that you can do real-time data collaboration, real-time, file sharing, et cetera. And so they're actually in that range that you can actually still do all of the same things you would do with Google Drive or Dropbox in a much more secure way. And the solution is up to 10,000 times more secure, and it's such an interesting solution that IBM has made it an embedded solutions partner. This means IBM is going to be actually selling this product to governments, financial institutions, law firms, accounting firms, or any companies that have very important high-value data that they don't want to get hacked. In the banking and finance sector, HSBC just announced that they've been using blockchain for well over a year, doing 3,500 to 5,000 transactions per day on their own private blockchain to move money between different operations internally. They moved $250 billion US over the last year, and they've said that it has a 25% savings on what would have been the traditional alternative using things like SWIFT and the traditional ways to move money. So very important, tangible benefits to HSBC. Companies like Zed Network are helping on the consumer remittance side, or company remittance side as well. And what they do is they work with money transfer operators to use cryptocurrency that is stable and within transferring money between countries. And there's up to a 75% savings for customers and clients. In the investment banking industry, we're talking about a company called Polymath, which I'm an advisor of. It's a very well-known company in the blockchain space, especially across North America. And what they're doing is looking at securitizing things like company ownership. Can your equity of your company be on blockchain and use tokenization as a way to measure and represent the shares in a company? Or, what about securitizing and tokenizing assets or liabilities of a company? So there's many different things that you can look at where blockchain can help. This is very interesting for the areas of, say, fundraising as a company globally. So what's very expensive in the finance industry and investment banking industry is trying to raise capital in different countries or different jurisdictions. And where Polymath is working on is decreasing the cost of those regulatory constraints related to fundraising, for example. And that's just one thing. And the way that they do that is there's a lot of very repetitive things that happen as part of a regulatory process in fundraising. Let's say in the United States or Canada or Japan. There's a lot of things that you just need to follow and check off. And so what they're doing is they have a lot of legal support in helping them build and ensure that they can get all of the things that are very repetitive built in to essentially a system that then says, I want to fundraise in Japan. You can basically drag and drop to get 90% of the things that you need to get done to follow legislation in Japan. Now maybe you just need a lawyer for 5 or 10% that relates to very specific nuances related to your business. And so you can now look at how do you fundraise more effectively globally. The other benefit with this is smaller fundraising tickets. Rather than needing to fundraise, $100,000 or $200,000 or $1 million from certain types of investors, you can have fractional ownership of $25,000 investments of private securities or $10,000. And they're also looking at secondary trading markets, so almost like a mini stock exchange where you can then buy and sell these tokens which represent equity or assets, other types of assets or liabilities in that company. This could apply to a lot of different things like real estate, art, or other illiquid markets as well. Social impact. So this is something that we're working on with the United Nations. And what we're looking at is how emerging technologies, including blockchain and cryptocurrency, can help transform global banking. How can we improve financial inclusion? How do we help unbanked and underbanked populations? How do we work with central banks to leverage the benefits of blockchain? So things like we talked about the ability to trace and audit related to blockchain. Imagine that with money. You could trace as a central bank everywhere that money is going. Now think about things like terrorism financing, drug financing, things like this. You could actually start to trace this and start to prosecute and eliminate these things from being done with the currency. So it actually creates a lot of transparency. There's a number of other benefits, and it gets pretty complex with what we're doing with the United Nations because we are working with a lot of central banks and a lot of finance ministers and key decision makers in their countries on where blockchain makes the most sense. There is areas that benefit consumers significantly. One of the UN Sustainable Development Goals is lowering the cost of remittances, so sending money abroad. And the goal is to bring it down to less than 3%. This is one of the areas where blockchain and cryptocurrency have a major impact and identified as one of the only ways to really achieve that goal effectively. In terms of decreasing the risks and costs related to KYC and anti-money laundering, this is another area that there's an issue in the world. It's pretty complex, but it's called de-risking. What de-risking means is global banks don't want to work with developing country banks because they don't know, essentially, they don't have the transparency. They can't understand, where the money is going, who's touching it in these developing country banks. And one of the areas that we're proposing and looking at using blockchain is creating a layer for the developing country banks to prove the information that they have and create a set of records that cannot be manipulated so that you have improved ability to audit this. And that will increase the likelihood that global banks will work with developing country banks, which will help tens of millions of people in terms of access to financial products and banking services. The entertainment sector. There's a company called All Rights that is creating an entirely new business model because of the benefits of blockchain that they otherwise could not create. So a company like All Rights is competing with Netflix. And the way that they're doing that is there's a few things. So they've created an entire ecosystem. The first part of it is a B2B, so business to business way to sell and move content, so professional content. We're talking about movies, we're talking about TV shows, and other types of professional content that you guys watch all the time. And what this database does, what this B2B system does is the way content works is it's sold in there's three factors that are the most important to know. The first factor is that content is sold by country, okay? The second thing is that it's sold on a time length. Typically, it is licensed for 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. It's typically longer than a year because it's very difficult and a lengthy process to buy content. The third thing is that it's sold on a type of format, whether that's online or cable, pay-per-view, or other types of formats. And so based on this, All Rights is already selling content to companies like Netflix, Sony, MediaCorp Singapore, Jiangsu TV. So they're already working with partners like this. The second part that they're doing is based on those factors, so the country, the time length, and the format, they're putting this onto the blockchain. So now there's a central source of truth that cannot be manipulated on where and how the content is being sold. And so what happens right now with the best shows in the world? Many shows that are, say, Emmy nominated or very famous, they'll only sell to 20 countries or 30 countries. That means we're talking about 170 or 180 countries that are not monetized. The only way to get this content is to steal it, to pirate it, to download it illegally. Now, what All Rights is looking to do is launch a consumer version, so a streaming service similar to Netflix. But the thing is, they don't have to pay for the content because they already have all of the sellers and they know exactly where it's been sold and licensed. And so what that allows them to do is a revenue share business with all of the content producers for all of the countries where the content is not sold. And this is something Netflix can't do. And this actually, so Netflix spends $13 billion a year acquiring content, and companies like All Rights already have as much content in Asia as Netflix, and it's likely to grow significantly more than that. The last example we wanted to go through was in the education sector. How many of you have heard of Sean Kawakami? Do you guys know Sean Kawakami? And so you may have heard that he had a fake Harvard Business School degree. There's also the Yahoo CEO, the previous Yahoo CEO had a fake degree. And so this is a problem. How do you eliminate all of these issues related to fake degrees and transcripts? Because there's a very big cost to our economy with people trying to cheat the system. And so companies like Open Source University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology are using blockchain as a central source of truth, where basically once transcripts and degrees are validated on the blockchain, employers can go, and maybe they have to pay for it, but they can access that instantly. You also got other higher education institutions or other individuals or companies that want to check these credentials that can check them without it being manipulated. I mean, if companies check right now, they usually ask you to mail a copy of your transcript or degree or take a photo. That's very easy for people that want to manipulate or cheat the system to do it. And so this is a great area where blockchain is also having a major impact on transforming and cutting out cheating within credentials related to academia. And so the implications for Japan, there's a substantial opportunity to foster growth and have Japan take advantage of these technologies within different industries and to lead on these innovations. There's the opportunity to reduce the cost of remittances from Japan, which is $4.2 billion US, or even improve things like in the banking sector to move money internally or within the country, which can be more efficient. New business models are possible using blockchain. As we talked about with All Rights, and other companies could have more innovative business models that can increase value to consumers and to the bottom line of the company. And you can save time and costs, which are already being generated now in other industries that are being proven around the world. And we can leverage and embrace these technologies in Japan to help make our companies better, stronger, and faster. So thank you so much. I am open to take a few questions, and if you do want to message me, feel free to, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Oh, do we have a over here?
はい、マイクをお持ちいたします。
Thank you very much for your precious seminar. 質問としては2つございまして、まず1つ、wait, do you need to translate?
Actually, I think she can translate. So you can say it in Japanese and she can translate for me.
Okay. 2つほどご質問がありまして、1つ目は、まずそのブロックチェーンをその企業さんへ入れるプロセスの中で、その RP を導入するときにも企業って少しずつデジタルトランスフォーメーションという形で変わっていくと思うんですけど、ブロックチェーンを導入するときに課題になった点っていうのはどういうものだったのか。So my question was, when so it's like similar to implementing RPA. There's a lot of hurdles, transformation within the government, within the corporation. But when you install blockchain instead, what were the issues and any kind of issues that you faced when you were installing it? And my second question is, そのブロックチェーンを日本企業が活用するためにはどういう人材が必要なのかっていう点ですね。はい。
Okay, so in terms of the first question on how to essentially identify areas that you can essentially implement blockchain, right? I think that is your question. So it is still in early technology and it is developing, but we're seeing very clear use cases where it's saving companies money and it's helping them be more efficient. And so the best way within your organization to identify it is to, one, get an understanding of blockchain and some of the benefits, so some of those innovations that we talked about. Try to understand within your company, whether it's directly or bringing in a consultant that understands and can understand your business and determine very specific processes or areas where blockchain might have a very strong impact. Where is it going to save costs? Where is it going to increase sales? Where is it going to maybe benefit consumer information or other types of information that'll be beneficial to the company? And when you're able to do that, you can carve out a very specific area and then try to launch a pilot on that with specific KPIs and goals on what types of achievements you're trying to achieve. And that would be probably the best way in terms of understanding and seeing where blockchain can have an impact. Another way is looking at some of the examples we talked about or looking at other companies like your competitors and see if they're doing anything with blockchain and try to understand also where they're doing it. So if you are a little behind, you can look at your competitors and see where are they doing it, how are they finding value using technologies like blockchain, and then look to do potentially something similar initially. In terms of the second question, I didn't hear it, so maybe you can, maybe you can just share it in English.
So I guess like the first question I was trying to ask you was, what were the issues when, with the case studies that you provided, like was it easy to transform into the method of using blockchains when you wanted to audit the food and see like that? Was it easy?
So that's a good question. I mean, new implementations, of course, are never easy, right? I mean, there is a whole process of getting people on board with this new system if they are going to be personally involved with it. There is the fact that, information, like for example, when we talked about the mislabeled beef, right? Like the horse meat. I mean, there's the intention itself to, essentially mislead the whole purpose of it. And so, of course, you need to get the different parties involved and then understand exactly where the benefits are. Using things like IoT, you can, eliminate some of the manual inputs. But in reality, a lot of this information is already tracked or collected. It's just not put into, I would say, a blockchain, which is essentially an advanced database. And so if you're already collecting the information, like if we take supply chain, signatures are already happening. People are already tracking in reality where items are going. Like you do know who all your suppliers is, it's just not tracked in a way where you can connect all the dots. And so a lot of this information is being collected, it's just how you then leverage and get the value from that information, which can be enhanced with blockchain.
Thank you. And the second question was, what kind of human, I guess, people do you need to enable? So what kind of people do you gather to enhance, to basically move the project with the case studies that you were discussing?
Yeah. So in terms of how we collected the data, is that?
I mean, the people, more of the human resource, not the human resource, but was it the data scientists that you?
So there are different people involved. Of course, senior executives or senior managers of their companies do need to identify where they find value. There is, of course, benefits related to having good data scientists to help understand and extract value from some of this data. But it does impact across the business, right? We talked about auditability and individuals that have to audit that, or regulators and how they would be involved in that process. And so this does create an impact across major parts of the business. So it is a pretty big initiative to try to put
誠に恐れ入りますが、ちょっとお時間がですね、かなり過ぎておりまして、大変申し訳ございませんが、ここで失礼させていただければと思います。大変申し訳ございませんが、お許しくださいませ。アリ・マドハブジー様でございました。どうぞ大きな拍手をお願いいたします。ありがとうございました。ご協力ありがとうございます。